It's been over 2.5 years that Bryan Kohberger has maintained his innocence and then changed his plea deal at the last minute to guilty of all the crimes in the Idaho 4 slayings. So what led to that change of the plea deal? Here are my top 5 reasons, relatively ranked in order, on why Bryan Kohberger changed his plea at the last minute. Coming in at number 5 on my list, counting down to number 1, the most likely, if you will. Number 5 is Bryan Kohberger is in some kind of witness protection program. Now, I know that a lot of people have thought about this, and I have to say there is reasons for believing it's true. It's not completely wild-ass speculation. For example, in the courthouse when I was at the plea deal, there were federal marshals everywhere. Ada County, Boise, Idaho, is the seat of the federal marshal's office in Idaho. Bryan Kohberger's case was moved out of Latah County and put into Boise, Idaho, downtown, where the federal marshals literally have their headquarters. The entire purpose of the federal marshals is to do things like protect people in witness protection, WITSEC programs. That their job is to protect high confidential assets, those who are in protection of U.S. government forces like the FBI and so on. That's what federal marshals specialize in. So the fact that the federal marshals were all over the courthouse that day, there was rumors early on that the federal marshals had gone into the 1122 King Road residence shortly after the slayings, and people were wondering why federal marshals might be showing up there. That would indicate that somebody involved in this case may be involved in witness protection program. And that sounds a little crazy, except for, again, there's reasons why the case may have been moved out of the local county and down to Boise that weren't just what they told you, which is that Bryan Kohberger couldn't have gotten a fair trial in Idaho, or sorry, in the local city, and so therefore he was moved to Boise. It could actually have to do more with the federal marshal's protection of Bryan Kohberger. In that kind of scenario, the reason would be is if Bryan Kohberger has evidence against a much bigger fish. In other words, if there's a drug hit element, as many people have indicated in this house, and there is a crime syndicate or organization that might go down in part because of Bryan Kohberger's testimony against others involved or something to that matter, then Bryan Kohberger could be protected against basically the death penalty and other things in exchange for his testimony against much bigger fish, a crime syndicate, or people much more interesting to the government than a mass murderer of a few college students. So in that kind of scenario, there could be a situation in which the government is working with Bryan Kohberger. And in fact, there was some indications that Steve Gonsalves himself had said something to the effect on Piers Morgan's interview, I believe, we might as well just allow the state to have Kohberger as an asset. Why would he be an asset unless the government is actually using Bryan Kohberger for a much bigger case? That could be part of the reason for the plea deal. Coming in at number 4 is exculpatory evidence, or the idea that no one was going to be allowed to testify on Bryan Kohberger's behalf. There was indications, for example, that Ann Taylor had submitted a request for Bethany Funk to be subpoenaed and testify because she had exculpatory evidence. What that means is Bethany Funk, according to Ann Taylor, had information that would prove her client's innocence, or at least certainly put it in a very, very likelihood that he couldn't have done it. Bethany Funk was fighting that. Bethany Funk had left the state and was being protected, in my opinion, by the federal government. There is indications in Howard Bloom's book, When the Night Comes Falling, that there was a confidential informant that was being protected, and Steve Gonsalves was told to stay away from that person and not talk to them. If that person has exculpatory evidence and the government was helping make sure that she would never have to testify, even though what she would testify to could exonerate Bryan Kohberger, then it was a rigged trial. In other words, no one was allowed to speak on behalf of Bryan Kohberger. This is something that Ann Taylor said multiple times. We're having a really hard time getting people to talk to us, Ann Taylor said. So if Bethany Funk, as an example, had exculpatory evidence, such as she saw somebody at the back of the house at the sliding glass door putting clothes into a bag and walking out of the house in underwear, as many rumors had been saying that she saw that, If she saw that person and it wasn't Bryan Kohberger, for example, and she testified at some point to police officers or whatever at such point, and they're all burying that and keeping it hid out of the public eye. And if Ann Taylor is like, look, let's get Bethany Funk on the stand and tell everybody exactly what she saw at the back of the house that day, because it wasn't Bryan Kohberger, and that's going to change this whole trial. If they took steps to make sure Bethany Funk would not have to testify, and no one else is going to come forward to say, look, we know there were other people in the house, people who saw things, who are shutting their mouths and stonewalling and using protection perhaps to not have to testify about what they really saw, which might shed doubt, then that would be another reason for the plea deal. If no one's allowed to give exculpatory evidence, if no one is either willing to, they're going to lie about it, they're going to cover it up, or they're not allowed to give that evidence, then there's no reason to fight it. No, the people who know what could set you free are either refusing to talk or not being allowed to talk. Coming in at number 3 is the idea that Bryan Kohberger is simply buying time, that by basically admitting to the crime, it gives them more time to prove that he couldn't have done it. It's a stall tactic. The main thing, of course, on the table for Bryan Kohberger is to take the death penalty off the table. The prosecution wants to execute him as quickly as possible. That's one of the things that came out in the book When the Night Comes Falling by Howard Bloom, is that the state was actually ahead of time making sure that the state had the chemicals in place to kill Bryan Kohberger. And if not, they were making sure to rush the firing squad as an option. And while that doesn't make a lot of sense, because death penalty cases often are appealed and appealed and appealed, and it would take time, the point is that they were working very, very quickly to try to make sure they can execute Bryan Kohberger as quickly as possible. If Bryan Kohberger feels that someday something's going to come forward, or a person who has exculpatory evidence will step forward at some point in the future, then perhaps he would take a plea deal simply to buy him time. Because again, keep in mind, and this is the part that many people don't seem to understand, now that the facts have been established, the plea deal is set the timeline. This is the time that you arrived, this is the time you entered the house, and this is what you did. If at any point in the future, even 5-10 years from now, something comes out that proves Bryan Kohberger could not have done the things that he actually pled guilty to, then it would change the plea deal, despite the fact that it says that there's no appeal option for him, that he can't appeal it. Because one of the caveats, one of the little loopholes that people aren't remembering, is that if you confess to something and you could not have done it, then your plea deal is off the table. So if something comes out, for example, later on that proves that Bryan Kohberger was across town, completely in a different place, such as something really good, like video evidence that shows Bryan Kohberger at a gas station 10 miles away at the time that they say the murders were happening, that information would change the plea deal, even if he had no appeals options, because it means that he could not have actually committed the crime that he confessed to. People do confess to things, and people do take plea deals on things that they didn't commit in order to avoid the punishment. So if Bryan Kohberger doesn't want to be put to death, and he didn't do it, but he feels like getting put to death is a certainty if he doesn't take a plea, he could take a plea just to save his life. It doesn't necessarily mean that he did it. And maybe it's buying time for something to come out later that will prove he couldn't have done it. So it just simply takes off the death penalty. Coming in at number 2 was that idea that this was never going to be a fair trial from the get-go. Bryan Kohberger had the deck stacked against him. Right off the bat, Hippler stated publicly that he didn't want to do this trial, that he didn't want to be there. He was not happy to be sitting over this trial. His face during the entire proceedings of all pretrial hearings have been one of complete and utter disdain and boredom, especially for the defense. In every case, practically, when the prosecution wants something, Hippler bent over backwards to give them what they wanted. In almost every single case, when the defense wanted something, he fought them and told them it was a waste of time, that we already know Bryan Kohberger did it, which is something a judge should never have that attitude, but that certainly was his attitude. Bryan Kohberger did these crimes. DNA is DNA every day of the week and twice on Sunday was one of his famous lines. He thinks that there's no question Bryan Kohberger did it. His DNA was at the scene, and that's coming from the sitting judge. The fact that the judge fought everything. No, you can't bring in alternative witnesses to the stand because we know Bryan Kohberger did it. No, you can't bring in an idea that somebody else did it that lived nearby because we know the killer arrived in a white Elantra, even though that's supposed to be established in court. Judge Hippler has already concluded that the white Elantra is part of the crime, and therefore somebody who lived next door couldn't have been involved in the crime, because why would a person drive a white Elantra to a crime scene if they live right next door? And that was his logic for why I'm not going to accept the idea that somebody next door could have done it. The point being is that Hippler showed every step of the way that he was biased on this case and already believed Bryan Kohberger to be guilty from day one. Under those circumstances, and the fact that the judge constantly ruled in favor of anything pro-prosecution and shut down any argument, including the expert, Cy Ray, who wrote the book and literally taught law enforcement how to do advanced timing records, when he says, I need to testify for the first time in my life on behalf of a defendant because there's no way Bryan Kohberger's data shows what you say it's showing. I wrote the book. I wrote the software. And Judge Hippler calls that man a conspiracy theorist and says there's no reason for him to testify. This was a rigged trial from the very beginning. Bryan Kohberger was never going to get a fair trial. And that could be one of the main reasons why he accepted the death penalty, or the plea deal, to avoid the death penalty, because it wasn't going to be a fair trial. And then coming in at number one, and this is the one that's super difficult for a channel like mine that believes in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in a court of law, and I will maintain that all day, every day, and twice on Sunday. Thank you, Mr. Hippler. But the point being is that coming in at number one is the possibility that Bryan Kohberger actually did it, or that he was very much involved in the situation. And in many states, and I'm sure Idaho is the same way, if you're an accomplice to murder, it's the same thing as committing murder yourself. So even if there's a scenario in which all the people say, as myself included, believes that one person couldn't have done this, that there had to have been some help in some form or another. Even if you believe that there was help for Bryan Kohberger and that he was one of the people involved, even if it was just as a cleaner who went in and helped cover up some of the stuff, even if there was any part of him that was involved in the murders of those people, then he's guilty of murder. And so therefore, there's always the possibility that Bryan Kohberger just simply did it and was admitting guilt because he did it. And even if he knew that there was other people involved, he would still get the death penalty. He would still get sentenced to murder for doing it. And again, at the end of the day, while I presume people's innocence, and I still think that there's real good reasons to believe that the official story sucks ass, and there's all kinds of questions that haven't been answered. And I will continue to ask those questions, and I will continue to get busted in the teeth by everybody telling me that I just won't let it go, that I'm trying to somehow maintain to the last minute that this guy isn't guilty, even though he told us he's guilty. That is the truth that we have to face. Bryan Kohberger has admitted guilt in this situation by taking a plea deal that says, I am guilty, and said in the affirmative over and over again, yes, I did it. Yes, I did it. Yes, I did it. Nobody's forcing me to say it. Yes, I did it. So at the end of the day, we would be morons and not intellectually honest if we did not accept that the most likely scenario might even be that he did it. And maybe that's the reason why he confessed to doing it and changing his plea, because he realized that all his defense avenues were shut down. He wasn't going to be able to get off on a technicality. And so maybe that's the reason why he said, fuck it. Yeah, I did it, because he knows maybe he did it. And again, it's not the popular one and a channel that presumes innocence until proven guilty, but it would be hard pressed to continue to act like it isn't the most likely scenario that a person who from day one has been the main suspect and all the circumstantial evidence lines up for the one guy. The thing that it keeps coming back to my mind is, if Bryan Kohberger isn't guilty, he's the most unlucky man that has ever existed on the face of the planet, because everything puts him circumstantially at that house. So either he really got unlucky and has a million things that make it look like he did it when he didn't, maybe he actually did it. And so that's something we have to consider. Now, at the end of the day, let me remind you, I will continue to ask questions in this case. I'm waiting for the documents to be unsealed. I'm going to ask questions about what the other roommates knew in the house that survived, because I feel like their stories don't match up. Everyone in America knows that. Even if you're a person who's been a guilter from day one saying Bryan Kohberger did it, you still don't understand why it took 8 hours for the survivors to call 911, and why when they didn't call 911 first, they called other friends to come over. The whole story doesn't make sense. You know it. I know it. We have questions. That doesn't mean at the end of the day that it still isn't going to be Bryan Kohberger did it. It's just that there's questions that are left unanswered, and we'll continue to answer. And let me add one more extra bonus thing. One more bonus that didn't fit into a top 5 list. There's some scenario in there in which Bryan Kohberger's parents were part of the plea deal and part of the equation. If, for example, Bryan Kohberger, as in number one, that he did it, if Bryan Kohberger had somehow admitted to his own family an admission of guilt, to his mother, to his father, whatever the case may be, if there had been a moment in where he admitted guilt in some way or form to his family, and his family knew that he had admitted guilt and kept it covered up, there may have been a possibility that his family was leaned on and say, not only is Bryan Kohberger going to go to jail, but you're going to go to jail for accomplice to murder. And maybe we'll look the other way if you can persuade your son to just admit to what he did, and we'll pretend like we'll understand why you as a parent would have covered that up when he told you about it, because it's understandable. You don't want your son to go to jail and get executed. But if you at least convince your son to take the fucking plea deal, we'll stop putting pressure to put you in jail as well. So that's just an extra bonus tip to the idea of he did it, and maybe pressure was put on the family, and that's why for the last minute deal. Thank you for listening to my top 5 list, and I'm sorry, I know it's going to offend some people in my ranking, putting the number one most likely option to be he actually did it. But again, at the end of the day, how do you be intellectually honest if you're going to say that the person who did the crimes and confessed to doing those crimes might not have actually done it? It's the Occam razor thing that people say all the time. The simplest answer is often the truth. If Bryan Kohberger said he did it, then chances are maybe he did do it. But again, I'm going to keep asking questions because this case is not over. There's a lot of problems in the case. There's a lot of things that need to be investigated still, just for our peace of mind. If we don't get the answers, then so be it. Have a good day. Oh, and don't forget, as an afterthought, stay tuned for my next video that's going to come out, which is going to be the top 5 reasons the prosecution and Bill Thompson offered the plea deal. Because if it was such a slam dunk as they say it was, then why did the prosecution change and offer a plea deal in the first place? If it's a slam dunk and there's no way Bryan Kohberger was going to get off, why offer the plea deal? Take a look at my next video that's coming out shortly on the top 5 reasons the prosecution offered the plea deal at the last minute.